What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the 10th installment into the Saw franchise, Saw X. Directed by Kevin Greutert, who directed Saw 6 and Saw 3D. This film is written by Josh Stolberg and Pete Goldfinger, who both wrote Jigsaw and Spiral. This film once again stars Tobin as John Kramer, Shawnee Smith as Amanda, and we have some new faces in here as well, like Synnøve, Macody, Lund, Stephen Brand, Renata Vaca, and many others. So here we are now with the 10th installment into the Saw franchise, and if you guys have been following this channel for a good time, then you know that a couple years back I did a full rewatch of the entirety of the Saw franchise, covered them all here, and also a couple years back, around the end of the pandemic era, I got the awesome opportunity to actually get sent an early screener for Spiral from the Book of Saw, starring Chris Rock, to cover here on the channel. I love the Saw franchise, good or bad. It's a franchise that I have a guilty pleasure attachment to. I really just enjoy these films and the big over-the-top twists and turns, convoluted narrative that it eventually would become, but I also just enjoy the tension and the gore and just the horror element of this franchise. Where there is silliness, there's still fun for me when it comes to this franchise, and for me, when it's really good, it's always been really good. And so with that said, when they said that they were going to be making another Saw movie after Spiral, I was definitely excited to see what they would do. I expected to see a continuation of that narrative, and then they announced that Tobin would be returning to play John Kramer, of course, Jigsaw. I'm assuming if you're watching this that you've at least seen some of the Saw movies, so I guess this isn't really a big spoiler, but the movie came out many years ago at this point, but John Kramer dies in Saw 3, and I was always just completely blown away that they consistently kept the character of Jigsaw, John Kramer, involved in all of these narratives, and sometimes while it may have gotten a little convoluted in some areas, using flashbacks to keep him involved in pretty much every installment after the third film, except for Spiral, was something that I always thought was really intriguing. So when I heard they were bringing him back, I figured this would be, you know, the next installment after Spiral, and that we would get another set of flashbacks that would expand upon John Kramer. But no, Saw X, or Saw 10, whatever you want to call this film, actually is squeezed right in between Saw 1 and Saw 2, giving us a little bit of added background to the character of John Kramer, and quite frankly, just giving us another tale to bring Tobin back as the iconic killer Jigsaw. And when I heard that that was going to be the case, and even when I saw the trailer, I felt like it had a been there, done that kind of feel and vibe. Not to mention, it's unfortunately incredibly noticeable that Tobin is a much older man now than he was when he was doing the Saw films originally. He was already an older man in those films and already kind of was meant to look a lot more old and decrepit as his character is dealing with cancer. But yeah, seeing him all these years later, he definitely looked substantially older in the trailers, alongside Shawnee Smith, who played Amanda, who again was much younger when she filmed those original films. Both of them still look great in this movie, and it's great to see them in these roles, but that was something that worried me going into this. Now, what are my thoughts on the movie? I had a blast. I thought this was a really good time, and I'm so glad that I was kind of worried about it, and it ultimately just kind of proved me wrong. When I saw the initial trailer for this movie, while it did look like classic good times with Saw, I was unfortunately feeling like, again, like there was a been there, done that feel to it. I felt like the trailer gave away too much, and I still do feel that way a little bit, but I wasn't necessarily pumping my fist. I was excited to see what they would do, but since it wasn't a continuation of the last film, and it just kind of felt like something that we've seen before, I just never really felt overly excited as we got closer to Saw. But as a fan of the franchise, I was definitely curious to see what they would do, so I was still going to go and see it this opening weekend. And after having seen it, I'm happy to say I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, as I mentioned, this movie is sandwiched in between the original Saw and Saw 2. And you might be wondering, so what's the story here? If you haven't seen the trailer, I'm going to talk about what you can at least see in the trailer in terms of the narrative. And the base premise of this movie is, of course, John Kramer is dealing with cancer. When he meets a man that was part of his kind of AA meeting version of like a cancer group. I don't really know what the terminology would be, but like cancer therapy group, if you will. And when he meets a man that is apparently cured after being in one of those groups with him, he tells him essentially, hey man, it's good to see you. I can see that you're still sick. I actually went and did these overseas, like, not FDA approved, like experimental drugs, like curing kind of treatment plan that made me cured of cancer, or at least has me in remission. And so naturally, John Kramer is intrigued by the premise, intrigued by the possibility of saving his life. So he ends up going down the path that this man set him up on. He ends up finding the individuals who actually do this kind of off the record or kind of out of the country curing of cancer, and he goes out to Mexico to go on with the procedure. He goes through the entire procedure and then ends up discovering that they lied to him. They never actually did any sort of surgical procedure on him. They didn't give him anything that was going to make him better, but instead just stole tons of money from him. And he finds out that they've been doing this to tons of other people who are terminal, who are dying, and he takes it upon himself in the classic John Kramer style and decides to put them all in a bunch of saw traps, and now they must fight for their lives. They have a chance to redeem themselves via these saw traps, and that's the base premise. I won't get too much further into some of the things that happen here. Like I mentioned, I think the trailer did give away a little bit too much of that narrative, because a lot of the beginning of this movie is him going to, you know, kind of be this hopeful individual and go to try to see what they can do for him. And I actually found that the first part of the movie was a really big change of pace for the Saw franchise. You're really getting a humanized version of John Kramer. And while I feel that all the other Saw movies do a good job of at least allowing you to sympathize with him to some degree, because he's just a lunatic who puts all these people in traps more often than not, and he's not the protagonist of those films, you know, it's easy to still paint him as the villain. But here we are with a Saw movie where he is the protagonist, and he's essentially getting revenge on people that are scummy, that are bad, that you do feel he needs to kind of do this too. And while all the people that are in Saw traps in the other films, for the most part, are scummy people as well, yeah, a lot of times it's one of those things where you feel like, okay, this is an extreme way to punish these people or make them fight for their lives. Whereas in this case, you totally sympathize with the character of John Kramer. They humanize him a lot more and kind of bring you along for the journey of him battling cancer. I feel even more so than the other Saw films did. There is a been there, done that kind of feel and vibe when it comes to the 10th installment in the Saw franchise, as you would expect. I don't necessarily think that this film had the goriest and the most cringe-worthy Saw traps in the entire franchise, but there were tons and tons of moments that definitely had me cringing in my seats. There were some great practical effects used here. There were some great moments of Saw traps that, you know, give you what you came to this movie for. The element that you come to this for, the tension, gory filled moments where people have to fight for their lives, is definitely present in this film, even if it doesn't necessarily have my favorite traps that this franchise has had. And there's been so many movies and so many traps now that I feel like that's going to be different for most people. But when it comes to the overall story, I found it to be engaging to watch. Again, I wish that the trailer hadn't showed as much, because I found myself really gripped to John Kramer in this movie, and I've always been gripped to him in the other films. I think he's one of the most interesting and most appealing horror villains of all time, but to see him in this movie where he is the protagonist and you're essentially rooting for him because he just wants to save his own life and is ultimately lied to and taken advantage of by these people, but this film definitely having an underlying message of how the medical field and doctors and that world is just filled with a lot of, you know, corruption. There's a big money-driven corruption at the center of a lot of it. We always constantly hear the idea that there possibly is a cure for cancer out there, or that if somebody's getting close to a cure for cancer, they might die or something like that, because they don't want to stop the medical business of keeping people on medication for their whole life, or having to go through different curing, you know, processes throughout their course of their life that are expensive, that end up just fueling the medical business. I think this is something that we all know. The pharmaceutical and medical world is just layered with corruption. And so this movie takes, you know, a big over-the-top Saw horror approach at making that commentary on real life stuff. And I think for the most part, it really works, while also adding in a fun Saw narrative. Overall, I found Saw X to be a great time. Saw X, Saw 10, whatever you want to call it. I think it was a great return to the Saw franchise. I enjoyed it personally a lot more than Spiral from the Book of Saw, as well as Jigsaw. I enjoyed it more than the last Saw movie, Saw 3D. And I would argue that I think it's probably one of the better sequels, and in this case, kind of a prequel, that we've gotten in the Saw franchise. It's hard to say exactly because I've only seen the film just now one time, but I do feel like as I add this one into the rewatch cycle, whenever I decide to rewatch the franchise again in the future, which I actually just rewatched them all a few months ago, showing them to my buddy Robbie for the very first time. Yeah, I think that this movie will slowly make its way up as one of my favorites in the franchise. It was fantastic to see Tobin Bell in the role of John Kramer again. Though he does look older, I'm happy that they actually gave him a really interesting story here. This could have easily just been another convoluted flashback kind of thing that adds more that we didn't really need, or maybe makes you scratch your head about how the events of the other films play out. This isn't a Saw film that's really looking to tie itself directly to the other Saw films as much. This is more about telling you an in-between story with John Kramer, giving us fans that Saw element that you want, but also, again, allowing you to really sympathize with John Kramer. It gives me a different outlook on him, and I feel like having this installment in the franchise is going to give viewers who watch this franchise in the future a different outlook on him moving forward. But again, it was great to see him. Again, it was great to see Shawnee Smith, who plays Amanda, again in the role. Again, the two of them do look older, and I think as somebody who's a bit of a continuity nut when it comes to movies and TV shows, there is that element that kind of bugs me at times where they don't necessarily look like it would, if you jump to Saw 2, they don't look like they would in that movie because they are quite a bit older in this movie. But for the most part, it was nice to see them again. I really enjoyed the film. The movie's not perfect. It has, again, that been there, done that element. There is a couple of characters that just kind of feel like throwaway characters. There is that traditional slasher horror element to the film that doesn't necessarily make it a perfect movie, but ultimately for a Saw film and as a Saw fan, I was very pleased with this film. I think if you're somebody who enjoys the Saw movies, maybe the last few didn't work for you, I think that this is going to revitalize your love for Saw. And if you're specifically a fan of Tobin Bell as Jigsaw, I mean, this is his movie even more so than the other movies that have come out in this franchise. I feel like it's elevated by the fact that we've seen him so much throughout the course of the other films, and this film just focuses solely on him, which I thought was fantastic. So anyway, I'm going to stop rambling now. Saw 10 is definitely a great time. Go check it out if you're a fan of Saw. But what I'll also say as well here, for anybody who's watching this and you're like, I don't really like Saw, would I like this? Probably not. Like if you're not a fan of the Saw franchise, the blood, the guts, the gore, if it's just torture porn to you, as a lot of people would, classify it to be, then I don't necessarily think this is going to change that for you. But I do think that this is a really strong installment in this series. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Leave any and all comments down below. Can't wait to hear what you guys have to say, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.